Let me start by saying that on behalf of the Philippine government, on behalf of the Philippine mission to the UN, to the United Nations, and on my own, I am really pleased that you are here and joining us in this, I would say, very important event, very important discussion that we're going to have. We are very pleased to be joining with various speakers, and they are, of course, the top caliber in their own field. But let me say that the Philippine mission, I myself is pleased that we are having a combined event with the Global Security Institute. And we are pleased to have the participation of the Holy See, the United Religious Initiative, the World Evangelical Alliance, One Buddhism International, Religions for Peace, Free Council of North America, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Of course, later on, we'll be joined by the High Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. As you all too know very well, we are going to engage ourselves in this discussion in this very important topic, very important subject. The former or the predecessor of Angela Kane, the High Representative of the UN for Disarmament Affairs, once said in Manila when we had a big conference preparing for 2010 review conference, and the newspapermen were asking for sound bites. He said, if we do not do anything about environment, very soon, maybe in 2, 3, 4 decades, the whole world may be a heap of garbage. And you notice that the engagement of civil society, of everybody, is so intense when you talk about environment. But if we do not do anything about nuclear arms, maybe by a flick of a second, by a flick of our fingers, we are all gone. That's the sound bites. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, friends, ladies and gentlemen, I will not say more. I will not say a lot of things because this is for our special guest to tell us something. I will just say a few words. One, long time ago, some time ago, I read a book by William J. Bennett about moral compass. Give us some perception of, we seem to know what is good, what is right, what is correct. But we may need sometimes a confluence, a collusion of bigger ideas, bigger people, informed people, so that we may be convinced what is supposed to be right. We should have it in ourselves. And that is the raison d'etre for what we are having now. The topic we are talking is nuclear arms. There is quite a lot of literature discussions on this and a lot of meetings. The last one being now happening. But as the Philippine delegation said in its statement 2 days ago, we are going to summon now these 3 elements of pillars, maybe the legal, the humanitarian, and the moral. Maybe something would come about it that we can push forward, and one day we see the light of the end of the tunnel, that we can all say that nothing will be hanging like a Damocles sword, that by a flick of a second we are all gone. So I would now yield to my co-chair, Jonathan Graham from the Global Institute. I know about many things about him and the good things he has done and his engagement in the subject, but I will be delaying the proceeding if I say a lot of things. So I would like to yield to him. Jonathan.
Thank you. Thank you. There it is. Thank you, Ambassador.
This is a great honor. One of the great honors is to see this audience, and I just want to recognize in this audience one of the towering figures of our time, Ben Ferenz, who over here, he's 95. Now, why he is such a towering figure is that he was a prosecutor in Nuremberg, in which the moral standard of every individual and accountability of every individual was set forth as a principle in the international legal community. He was also instrumental in creating the International Criminal Court. But it is the moral inspiration that he has provided me that I wanted to recognize, and that's why I recognized you, sir. This issue of the moral compass is seminal to our time. I was struck most recently by the fact that over 90 officers in the missile base in Montana were either fired or severely disciplined. Actually, the entire chain of command was dismissed. Why? Because they cheated on their examination. Now, cheating on examinations isn't morally acceptable. But what the debate failed to address and what the media failed to address is what these examinations were for. They were testing their capacity, their readiness, and their competencies to unleash destructive power which would end and extinguish forever human civilization. They manned 150 Minutemen missiles, each one being between 300 and 500 kilotons. That would constitute between 21 and 35 Hiroshimas per missile. That would end civilization. There was no debate on the moral compass. It is for that reason I believe this session is so important. There is a great need for a moral compass. I'm pleased to first introduce His Excellency, the Most Reverend Archbishop Francis Choulicat. His title need be quite simple. He is the permanent observer of the Holy See to the United Nations, appointed by Pope Benedict XVI in 2010. He essentially represents the Vatican here at the United Nations. Your Excellency.
Thank you, Jonathan. I wish to thank also Ambassador Libran Cabactulan for joining this and sponsoring this event. His ability and skill we have all experienced and acclaimed during the last review conference, and I'm so happy that he is with us, and his support for all the initiatives that we have undertaken so far in making the NPT alive and working, and so that all of us can work together for that total elimination of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. And this is something very particular that we are having this afternoon. Jonathan, as the GSI president, had this brilliant idea of bringing together religious leaders. And I have been one of those who have been supporting wholeheartedly, adding the voice of the religious leaders in this common effort for the elimination of nuclear weapons from the history in the incoming, at least in the incoming history of humanity, because nuclear weapons are practically useless and they are to be banned. And why the religious leaders have to take the floor on this particular issue. We know that we are not experts on disarmament affairs. We don't have technical solutions to offer, but we do have a voice to add in the public discussion that is going on this very difficult issue. So that is where the voice of the religious leaders comes in, so that the incoming generation will not blame the religious leaders for not having spoken out about this. the religious leaders do have something to say about these issues because it concerns the future of humanity. And they must say, and they must express their view on this, on whatever basis they think that that is the most appropriate way of addressing this issue. And that is where the silence of the religious leaders should never be there on this issue. And that is where Jonathan's role comes in bringing together the representative of various religious faiths today and giving them a floor to talk about this issue so that, as I said, we will not be blamed by the future generation for not having said and given that leadership, for not having said the truth about the whole matter, as well as given that leadership that is expected from various religious leaders around the world. So that said, I wish to congratulate once again the organizers of this panel for focusing on nuclear weapons and the moral compass. I have to apologize for the raspy voice I have this afternoon. I just had a flu, and I do have a doctor's appointment immediately after this, so I won't be staying with you. Usually I have a very nice voice, but this afternoon it is becoming rather raspy, so I apologize for that. So let me start with the words of Pope John the 23rd. Now, last Sunday he was canonized as one of the saints of the Catholic Church, Saint John 23rd and John Paul II. So I start my words with those words of Pope John the 23rd, which he wrote in his encyclical, 1963 encyclical Pacem in Terris, which was addressed to all humanity. Criticizing the nuclear arms race, the Pope wrote, "People," and I quote, "people are afraid that at any moment the impending storm may break upon them with horrific violence." He appealed not only for an end to the stockpiling of armaments, but a suitable disarmament program with an effective system of mutual control. That's in paragraph 112 of Pacem in Terris. Those words were soon followed by the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World, one of the chief documents of the Second Vatican Council, which stated, "Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities or of extensive areas, along with their population, is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal and unhesitating condemnation." These words are taken from Gaudium et Spes of the Second Vatican Council. Almost 5 years ago, the Secretary General offered a 5-point plan for nuclear disarmament. It is past time for this plan to be given the serious attention it deserves. The centerpiece is the negotiation of a nuclear weapons convention or a framework of instruments leading directly to a global ban on nuclear weapons. This is a clear-cut goal, fully understandable and supportable by all those who truly want the world to move beyond the dark doctrines of mutual assured destruction. Pope Benedict XVI, in his 2006 World Day of Peace message, criticized governments which continue to rely on nuclear deterrence for security. This point of view is not only baneful, but completely fallacious. He appealed to them to change course and strive for a progressive and concerted nuclear disarmament. The resources saved then could be applied to helping the poorest. Later, the Pope sent a message to the 2010 NPT Review Conference asking delegates to overcome the burdens of history and enter into negotiations for a progressive and mutually agreed dismantling of existing nuclear weapons. In my statement this morning, I have dealt extensively about this aspect, so I'm not going to go in depth about this issue of the nuclear deterrence. In 2012, Archbishop Mamberti, Secretary of the Holy See's Relations with States, addressing the Atomic International Atomic Energy Agency stated, and I quote, "The international community should show an effective and visible expression of intent to construct and strengthen a global legal basis for the systematic elimination of all nuclear weapons." And he added, "Nuclear weapons are useless in addressing current challenges such as poverty, health, climate change, terrorism, or national crime. The only way to guarantee that these weapons will not be used again is through their total, irreversible, and verifiable elimination under international control," unquote. And in his first message for the World Day of Peace in 2014, Pope Francis made his own the appeal of his predecessors for the non-proliferation of arms and for disarmament of all parties, beginning with nuclear and chemical weapons. For Francis showed us the way forward. I quote, "Give up the way of arms and go out to meet the other in dialogue, pardon, and reconciliation in order to rebuild justice, trust, and hope around you," unquote. Instead of condoning huge militaries, more weaponry, the lucrative arms trade, and the modernization of nuclear weapons, the Pope appeals for a halt to the arms trade and calls for total multilateral disarmament, starting with nuclear and chemical weapons. That is why St. John Paul II called the continual race to acquire weapons of mass destruction an immoral and wasteful expenditure in national budgets, which in some cases cannot even satisfy people's basic needs. It is in this spirit that I join with the religious leaders on this platform as we make a common appeal to the conscience of leaders and peoples throughout the world. No more nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons, never again. The Holy See has said many times that nuclear weapons contravene every aspect of humanitarian law. They are an affront to our stewardship of the environment inasmuch as they can destroy life on the planet and the planet itself. They must be done away with. By holding resolutely to these convictions, the Holy See hopes to awaken in the hearts of all people of good faith a renewed determination to ensure that never again will the horrors of nuclear war be visited upon humanity. Nuclear weapons are incompatible with the peace we seek for the 21st century. They cannot be justified. They deserve condemnation. The preservation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty demands an unequivocal commitment to their abolition. This is a moral challenge, a legal challenge, and a political challenge. That multiple-based challenge must be met by the application of our humanity. There can be no moral acceptance of military doctrines that embody the permanence of nuclear weapons. The use of nuclear weapons would constitute a grave moral act against humanity. It is time to renew the moral call for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, because in a nuclear war, there will be no victors, only victims. I thank you.
As I peruse the audience, I would be remiss to not recognize several particularly distinguished diplomats who are here. To my right, I see Ambassador Thomas Graham, who is on the board of the Global Security Institute, but importantly, he led the U.S. delegation in obtaining the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1995, as well as leading the U.S. in negotiating the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and numerous other key instruments for our safety. I would also be remiss in not recognizing Ambassador Kemet from Austria and Ambassador Kairat from Kazakhstan, both who are two of the leading voices on the progress toward a nuclear weapons-free world, and it's an honor to have you here. My dear friend, Ambassador Cabactulan, interestingly, not only has he been a leader in this area, he was the president of the 2010 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, which was very successful. 64 commitments were made for progress on disarmament. And Pax Sunt Servanda, another moral imperative, which is promises must mean something, remain outstanding. But it's not odd that he's also one of the leaders of the interfaith work in the United Nations, of bringing the different faith traditions together to dialogue and bring peace between the religions. And it is exactly that moral insight that commends his leadership in this forum on nuclear as well as interfaith. We have two of the leading interfaith organizational leaders on our podium today, but one from a particular tradition has been very active. One, the Reverend, the Venerable Chung Lok Lee, who represents the One Buddhist International here at the United Nations, and I have had the pleasure of seeing her speak at the Parliament of World Religions and other major interfaith forums, as well as having seen her inspire people in Seoul, Korea. Venerable Chung Lok Lee, please.
We are deeply grateful to the mission of the Philippines and the Global Security Institute for bringing us together today. Every life is precious and must be protected. Thus, working with you to end the threat posed by nuclear weapons is our commitment. Our action can destroy or honor the interconnected web of life and thus destiny of all sentient beings. Our actions are not only impact ourselves and nations of today, but also future generations. Never before has such a responsibility to act with a moral and ethical insight been greater. Buddhist ethics emphasize the importance of non-harming. This means cultivating a non-harming attitude toward oneself, others, and all living beings. It means being compassionate, gentle, considerate, and respectable toward oneself and others. In Buddhist ethics, do not hurt others in ways you would find hurtful is fundamental. Nuclear weapons offend this value. To unleash the destructive capacity of a nuclear bomb anywhere would be terrible moral, ethical, and spiritual consequences we must face. The adverse impact of victims would be horrible beyond words. In sum, one can hardly imagine an action more offensive to Buddhist morality than the use of a nuclear weapon. Fear and overarching desire to protect something we have created, the state, have been driven the creation of today's arsenals, which add up to more than 17,000 nuclear weapons. Their stated purpose is to help obtain security. We see a deep paradox here. The more perfected the weapon, the less security is obtained. The more we modernize the weapon, the more attractive they become. The more staged with the weapon, the more danger we all face. In Buddhist ethics, protecting innocent lives is a high value. Nuclear weapons offend this value. According to Buddhist understanding, everyone and everything in the world are deeply interconnected and interdependent. Thus, each one of us has an important responsibility to take care of our world. Therefore, it is critical to invite the active role of women. If we fully incorporate women's gifts, talent of half of a human population, we may find a new approach to tackle new nuclear weapons. In addition, we have an obligation to cultivate and create the culture of peace instead of cultural violence and war. The culture of peace is a set of values, attitudes, modes of behavior, and ways of life that reject violence and prevent conflict by tackling their root causes to solve problems through dialogue and negotiation among individuals, groups, and nations. We reject nuclear weapons based on the ultimate Buddhist ethics of nonviolence and protection of all living beings. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon described this issue so well. There are no right hands for wrong weapons. We pledge to work together with all people of goodwill to obtain this moral imperative. Nuclear weapons are immoral. Let us work together to rid the world of all of them. Thank you.
To my right is Dr. William Bentley, who is the Secretary General of the World Conference of Religions for Peace, which is certainly one of the most effective and influential bridge-building organizations in the world in bringing the religions together. I think that it is, in terms of the leadership of world religions, it is without parallel. It is a great honor to introduce you. Can't say more than you're the top of the heap in that regard. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your too kind introduction, and it's a pleasure indeed to be here. My comments are very much focusing on the growing interreligious consensus against, of a moral consensus against nuclear weapons themselves. I'd like to offer a kind of pre-comment and then offer just a few comments that I think lead towards a moral rejection of nuclear weapons. The pre-comment is, and I ask for people to use your imaginations, traditions are different, is to suggest that the world's religious traditions tend to prosecute their moral argumentation on two levels. There are different words for this in each tradition, but nevertheless the two levels are helpful. One level is the normative level, and the other, for lack of a better word, I'll say, is the pastoral level. And Rabbi Noble, we have you here, and I'm going to illustrate just briefly this point with your own tradition, which gave the 10 Commandments, one of which is, thou shalt not kill. What's instructive is that very short moral imperative doesn't say, thou shalt not kill unless it's inconvenient or unless it's a complicated situation. It's a simple, unvarnished, categorical norm, thou shalt not kill. Now, at the same time, that same tradition and many others recognize that reality is complicated, that there are tragic situations where goods conflict, and where, in the limit, the least worst thing to do might be, according to some traditions, in very restricted ways, might be to kill. Very, very sober reflections. But what's really key is that the religious traditions don't ever elevate that conflictual adjustment to the complication of competing goods up to the normative level. If you do kill, it's always wrong. Even if in some traditions, at some moment, you might be doing the least worst thing in that given moment. And traditions differ on this, of course. But the key point is that one doesn't elevate that pastoral, that circumstantial, that conflictual analysis where goods conflict into the normative. And I think there's a value in holding that in mind as we try to think of the moral case for the use of nuclear weapons. Let me just run through a few. On the use of nuclear weapons, it seems there's widespread moral concurrence across the religious traditions. It's beyond the pale. It doesn't add up. They're intrinsically indiscriminate. There's no way for them to be proportional to the wounds that just war theory might allow some thoughts about, and they violate humanitarian law. So like that categorical level that I described, thou shalt not kill, there doesn't seem to be any space at all for the use, the moral use of nuclear weapons. What about deterrence? The question gets stickier in this area. Is it moral to deter a nuclear attack by having weapons capable of inflicting a devastating counterattack? Recall, the pure argument is not even about using these weapons, although that's a bit of an abstraction given the way the actual armaments are triggered and monitored towards each other. But is simply having them, is that a moral act? Several points seem essential. First, to get a clearer understanding of deterrence. Deterrence does not mean threatening other nations with nuclear weapons or imposing one's national will on others by threatening them. The offensive threat of nuclear weapons is, again, I think, largely consensually agreed among the religions, completely immoral. It's not a moral act. But what about, again, pure deterrence? I think this is a key argument for us to try to examine, and it relates back to my pre-comment. Let me acknowledge that there are a diversity of religious views, ranging from a sharp proscription against deterrence to a limited acceptance of it. Let me speak of the latter. Increasingly, religious traditions are recognizing that there can be only a reluctant, limited, and temporary acceptance of deterrence, and only within the horizon of all nuclear states vigorously prosecuting their commitments to eliminate nuclear weapons. This may correspond to what I described as the pastoral level of religious moral discourse. Buddhists might describe it as employing skillful means. We have them, how are we going to get rid of them? The key point, though, again, is that this state of deterrence is not a good in and of itself, and it cannot be made normative. It is objectively morally disordered. Deterrence represents a form of gross moral failure that can be at best tolerated while states resolutely and methodically disarm themselves. Failure to commit to concrete steps to disarm, failure to enter in good faith with other states to disarm, is a profound moral failure. It de facto presents deterrence itself as normal, as a norm. And I think this is where it is profoundly, indeed, disordered. Here, I think we have to be honest. The inaction of nuclear states regarding disarmament is tantamount to elevating deterrence to be the de facto norm. And I think that's seriously morally disordered. Along the way, almost all religious moral thinking is advanced. What about maintaining nuclear weapons? Even if we said, well, okay, we're not going to use them for deterrence, we'll just hold on to a few. I think we've already mentioned the moral incoherence of elevating deterrence to the status of a norm, but we also have to look at accidents. Is it moral to renew and maintain weapons of mass destruction when there is a real statistical probability of accidents? Unfortunately, probability and time work together. The more time, the greater the possibility or probability for accidents. And such accidents, potential accidents, involve the same factors of indiscriminate and massive death and damage already mentioned. What right do we have to subject others or even ourselves to such risks? This leads me to my last point on the question of the morality of the possession of these weapons. Both ancient and many modern forms of moral argumentation revolve around the reality of self-contradiction. We use our intelligence, our wills, and our industry to advance knowledge and human flourishing. Are we to use our intelligence, wills, and industry against themselves? Is this not a massive self-contradiction in which we subvert ourselves to undercut the conditions of possibility of our own existence? Do we have the right to impose collective suicide? Do we have the right to impose even the slow, cancerous suicide of the contradiction of deterrence that eats away at the conditions of possibility of our humanity? Are we to numb our moral sensibilities, subvert our intelligence, and hijack our industry so that we can accept the abnormal as normal? I believe intellectual and moral coherence demands that we reject this path of self-contradiction. Finally, let me suggest that we need to update our concept of security, and that this updated notion of security can help us to frame again the imperative for nuclear disarmament. In 2006, Reverend Chung, you were present, 800 religious leaders gathered in Kyoto, Japan for the 8th World Assembly of Religions for Peace. Together, they advanced a notion of shared security. Yes, we need state security because the integrity of borders must be respected, but that's not enough. Yes, we need human security because the well-being of people within borders must be honored, but that too is today not enough. Today we need to advance and implement shared security. Your well-being is mine, and mine is yours. We are no more secure than the most vulnerable among us. This is true in practical terms, for no one is immune to the threat of nuclear weapons, but it's also true in moral terms, because all of our religious and other great moral traditions recognize that we are obliged, indeed we truly live, when we are in relationship with, cooperating with, and caring for each other. Is this possible? Religions, each in their own way, would give us the strength to say yes. And what is the alternative? Thank you.
The other most influential interfaith organization is the largest interfaith organization, with over 600,000 members with cooperation circles in, I think, 83 countries, in the largest people's interfaith dialogue in the world right now, engaging millions of people all over the world. And there is a circle within it that includes former Secretary of State George Shultz, Ambassador James Goodby, Sidney Drell, and it was out of discussions that George Shultz had gathered that we felt that how important it would be to raise the moral banner, and that the creation of that interfaith network really has happened because of the courage and the vision and inspiration of its founder, Bishop William Swing. Bishop Swing.
Thank you, Jonathan. Question. Is this working?
Hit the thing in the lower left.
Lower on the left. Here. Good. We're all together? Yes. Good. Question. What do the following tragedies have in common? The Columbine High School shooting of April 1999. Number 2, the Virginia Tech mass killing of April 2007. The Boston Marathon bombing of April 2013.
the Jewish Community Center murders of April 2014. What do they all have in common? And the answer isn't April. What do they all have in common? In each instance, there was an interfaith service that was held immediately for everyone together in these communities, just as there was an interfaith service here in New York at Yankee Stadium after 9/11. That interfaith fact deserves attention. Here we had religions with ancient feuds, and in many instances around the world today, deadly religious rivalries. Nevertheless, when entire communities here needed to grieve, they wanted all the religions to come together to allow that to happen. And the religions obliged. The arc of history regarding the predictability of religious competition was bending. Religions coming together discovered that they had a common vocation for the good of the total community. Therefore, communities across this nation had an interfaith resource to serve the common good both then and in the future. Today, we gather to take a further step. Our focus is on nuclear weapons. It would be absurd to imagine in the future an interfaith service after the nuclear holocaust, which has already been planned and triggered for this city, for instance. No faiths would be left to collect the mountainous grief. Just as the first strike of the weapons that are aimed on us today would annihilate around 280 million people. At least, that is how many human beings we have targeted today in other parts of the world with our first strike. And I assume there to be some sort of reciprocity in numbers. In the face of a catastrophic nuclear Armageddon or the possibility of suitcase bombs, or the prospect of rogue states with nuclear designs, or individual madness linked with black market fissile materials and all the retaliations that go with all of the above, what has interfaith got to do with these threats? Is the only vocation for interfaith a defensive one after the fact of tragedy, or is there something unique and helpful that the interfaith movement could do up front beforehand to challenge the nuclear assumptions that have gotten us to this moment, to humanize the calculations, to prompt believers in God to face up to the abominations that we conspire to commit? I would like to submit that the genius of interfaith is its ability to gather people of a wide range of differing and conflicting persuasions in order to do something creative and deeply needed for the total community. Translated into nuclear disarmament terms, I believe that the interfaith movement could mobilize and energize a far greater team of advocates than now exists. I was just this last week listening to the people from Plowshares, who say they get 90% of their funds from people who are over 65 years of age. Young people just do not care. I hear college professors and clergy say that young people are simply not interested in the nuclear issue. Yes, parliamentarians are doing their bit. Motivated policy people are stepping up to the plate. The quartet writes op-eds that catch momentary attention. Faiths and interfaith groups issue declarations of gravity and high purpose. Petitions are signed by tens of thousands, circulate from time to time, yet, when all is said and done, most every entity operates in a silo and doesn't touch the heart of the young people. We who are silent colleagues of one another simply do not work together and use our best gifts. I'm not advocating that we only coalesce the forces that presently exist, for instance, in this room. All of them are good and needed, and yes, we could come together and make a little more of a difference, but what I propose is that interfaith resources be used to unleash a much wider imagination, especially among young people. We need artists and filmmakers, hip-hoppers and storytellers. We need to point out that the nuclear issue is the environmental issue. We need to compete with apocalyptic movies to state that the apocalypse is not entertainment. It is a real threat that needs the good guys to overcome the bad guys. We need to mine the motherlode of stories of nuclear accidents and close calls and heroes and victims and nuclear greed and insane claims of security and the myth that a super race of people should decide who should be armed and who should be unarmed. We need to tell the whole truth about the financial price being paid and the length of the cleanup and who will be left holding the dump. We need to heed the scientists telling us about the Big Bang of creation and face up to the Big Bang that we're going to make that could smash the creation to destruction. We need to make this issue available to young people with all of the fear and all of the hope that accompanies nuclear possession and nuclear responsibility. And why? Because the people who control nuclear issues have full media range to tell their myths and mute the real figures and keep the voice of the people and the conscience of the people and the vote of the people far removed from difference making. Why shouldn't we, the people, have a say in forming a more perfect union? We could if the door to reality and imagination about nuclear threat would be unlocked. I propose that the interfaith enterprise, which in many ways has been born in grief, might well be positioned to unlock the door to nuclear awareness among the young. It is high time for fresh air to come into that stale room of doom. Thank you.
I would be remiss if I didn't announce that we intend to take this message on the road. This is just an announcement that the moral compass is going to be clear, it's going to be loud, and we're going to stay the course until we come to the safe harbor of a world without nuclear weapons. And one of the most influential voices in moral compass in the world is the World Evangelical Alliance. It's large, over 650 million people, and they were proudly instrumental in getting the support of key countries for the recent arms trade treaty negotiations. We have the leadership of the World Evangelical Alliance here with Reverend Tullicott and Deborah Fikes, who's the UN representative. And their spokesperson on this issue, full disclosure, he was, I think, our first hire of the Global Security Institute when he was an honors graduate from Swarthmore College. And when he was at Yale Divinity School, roomed with my son. So I love this man. He has been a hope in my heart that the flame of pursuing peace and a nuclear weapons-free world that my conscience awakened is passed on to the next generation. He is a leader. He is an inspiration. He is an ordained Baptist minister and the chairman of the Global Task Force on Nuclear Weapons of the World Evangelical Alliance, Tyler Wiggs-Stevenson.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm deeply grateful to the Permanent Mission of the Philippines and to the Global Security Institute for hosting this event, with special thanks to Ambassador Cabactulan and Jonathan for inviting the World Evangelical Alliance's participation. The WA is one of 3 global Christian bodies, representing, as Jonathan said, more than 600 million across 129 national alliances, and it's my honor to join the other speakers and offer remarks on behalf of the WA today. Now, of course, one of the benefits of being an evangelical is that nobody expects you to be moderate in any way, shape, or form, so I will just jump right in. Let's begin by admitting that nearly 70 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that which can be thought about the immorality of nuclear weapons has already been said. We should not be anticipating some new piece of moral reasoning so sharp it will cut through the Gordian knot of global nuclear politics. Certainly, it will not come from the WA. Humility demands that we acknowledge that we are late in coming to trenches where our brothers and sisters from the Roman Catholic Church and World Council of Churches, as well as our neighbors from many other faith traditions, have labored long and faithfully, and hopefully our immoderation will make up for our tardiness. But to clarify that the 3 global bodies representing between them the world's 2 billion Christians are in vocal agreement on this matter for the first time in history, it's worth noting. Let me recapitulate that which we all know. Nuclear weapons, like every other creation of human hands, are a technology. At base, merely a technology. And like all technologies, they give us a capacity or an ability to do a particular thing, which in this case is make an unimaginably large explosion. Like all technologies, they cannot be uninvented. And thus, like all technologies, the first moral question regarding nuclear weapons is, what are the normative moral parameters for this capacity? Well, the 69-year and counting taboo against the use of nuclear weapons in war constitutes a robust de facto norm of non-use, the de jure force of which is upheld from a Christian perspective by any analysis of the theological ethics governing war and peace. And that means that the only legitimate goal for such weapons is that they never be used under any circumstances. Given this operating principle, then, the second moral question regarding nuclear weapons, which should unite us all, is which is the prudential structure best suited to manage the technology toward this outcome? Well, it's been alluded to already. During the Cold War, the prevailing conventional wisdom was, of course, that the threat of nuclear weapons, deterrence, was an essential component of ensuring their non-use. I leave aside for now whether that was ever moral. But in the multipolarity of the post-Cold War era, the perpetual reliability of deterrence to prevent nuclear conflict seems implausible at best. It is certain that the NPT and the nuclear power's reliance on deterrence cannot indefinitely coexist. Indeed, because deterrence requires nuclear possession, it incentivizes proliferation and thus instability, making it a seemingly self-defeating strategy, and thus a technique ostensibly intended to ensure nuclear non-use instead leads inexorably toward the opposite end. Now, however, a new conventional wisdom has emerged for anyone with eyes to see, at least, that the only prudential strategy with a chance of resulting in perpetual nuclear non-use is the universal prohibition and verifiable elimination of these weapons. And if this is true, then this is the only politics and the only policies deserving of any derivative moral sanction. Unfortunately, our actual politics may be going in precisely the opposite direction, but not because of moral disagreement, but because the narrowly conceived near-term security interests of each state seem to counsel precisely the opposite course of action that is required by the long-term existential security interests of all states. And I confess it thus seems unlikely to me that moral discourse will penetrate and transform the immediate situation. I may be the dour one up here. And as a result, I believe there is every likelihood that the countries of the world will fail us and will lead us into some form of nuclear catastrophe. I'm speaking personally here. The WA is not in the prognostication business. So what then of the moral compass? Why then speak if we cannot guarantee the efficacy of our words? A Roman general returning from foreign conquest in ancient days enjoyed the glory of a triumphal procession through the eternal city. And as legend had it, it was custom for him to have his slaves sit with him in the chariot. and beneath the roars of the acclaiming crowd, the slave would murmur over and over again, memento mori, memento mori. Remember that you too will die. You, O king, are also mortal. We who traffic in moral claims are the slave, and we must be as relentless. Our words lack any power to compel. Our declarations are only accepted when they align with national interests. We are, in fact, entirely powerless. But our words are powerful because they are true. And that truth is that no matter how powerful the king, there is an authority that is greater still. The apparent absence of this authority on a global level, of course, is in fact the very crisis which the United Nations was created to address. And it will always be easy, even self-evident, for the powerful of the world to imagine that nothing and no one stands above them. But no, we say, there is a God in heaven who will someday judge. And therefore we speak so that there is a record of witness that no nation may stand before the throne of judgment and claim that they did not know. Well, and what is the standard of this judgment? Just this, that the stakes of the nuclear wager radically exceed the moral accounts of any nation. The recent rise in discussion about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, whose conferences the legal nuclear powers have so far decided not to attend, is a welcome reminder that these devices are not simply the province of state security. These are weapons of indiscriminate destruction with potentially limitless effect, and the lives that they put at risk are not trifling matters. The power that nations wield often gives them the illusion of substance. But states, and I mean no insult to those who serve their interest here, it's a noble calling. States, for all their worth, are purely functional entities existing to serve their people. They are at best beneficial fictions, albeit with guns. And at worst, they are demonic powers and principalities. They were not created in the image of God. Christ was not crucified for them. And the greatest of empires has less standing in the court of heaven than a single child. So we here respectfully remind them of their relative stature and plead that they recalibrate their standards of security. And who knows? Perhaps our murmuring in the chariot will have some effect. I don't expect it to, because the kings of the earth are notoriously deaf to the pleas of servants. But we may take hope by remembering that God has done stranger things than these. When the prophet Jonah preached God's judgment over Nineveh, the king put on sackcloth, and the city fasted and raised lament and repented, and all were saved. Thank you.
One child. Thank you. It is a great honor to introduce our next speaker. She speaks on behalf of the Secretary General, who has put forward a compass for the world, a compass point of obtaining a nuclear weapons convention or framework of legal instruments eliminating nuclear weapons. It's our hope that this moral voice, joined with that legal direction, will help lead us there. Ms. Angela Kane is the United Nations High Representative at the level of Undersecretary General for the Office of Disarmament Affairs. There is no other spokesperson in the entire world speaking for this august body specifically on this specific issue. It is truly an honor to have you join us.
Never have advance applause. You know, I might say terrible things today, but I am really very pleased to be here, and I want to thank the Permanent Mission of the Philippines and the Global Security Institute for organizing this very important discussion and for inviting me to speak. And of course, I'm using the official title, but I want to say that my good friends, Ambassador Libran, Cabactulan, and the GSI President Jonathan Granoff are constant interlocutors of ours and always very, very helpful for pushing the disarmament cart along the track, so to say. I want to remind you that 14 years ago, the United Nations hosted a remarkable event, and that was the Millennium World Peace Summit of Religious and Spiritual Leaders. It was attended by over 1,000 participants. And that summit produced a joint statement, and I really urge you to look at that again, because it began with these words, and I quote, "Humanity stands at a critical juncture in history, one that calls for strong moral and spiritual leadership to help set a new direction for society." We very often forget that this was crafted at this summit meeting 14 years ago. And included in that statement was a common commitment, and again I quote, "to join with the United Nations in the call for all nation states to work for the universal abolition of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction for the safety and security of life on this planet," unquote. Of course, that was certainly not the first time that nuclear weapons were described as threatening humanity. Let me recall the Russell-Einstein Manifesto of 1955, which concluded with these famous words, "Remember your humanity and forget the rest." Nor would this be the last time we hear about the basic conflict between humanity and the existence of nuclear weapons. We're witnessing it today in the many warnings of the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. And such concerns have given rise to a growing demand for an approach to disarmament that builds on duties and prohibitions found in international humanitarian law. I find it enormously reassuring that despite the many differences that persist among the world religious and spiritual leaders, they remain today united in agreeing that nuclear weapons still pose a significant threat to humanity and one that requires a collective response. Global nuclear disarmament is being viewed throughout the world as a moral and a legal necessity. It is rooted both in a recognition of our responsibilities as members of the same human family and legal obligations found in treaties as well as customary international law. In addition to this convergence between law and morality, we are also seeing a growing recognition among states and civil society that nuclear disarmament is also a practical necessity. With all of its safeguards and controls, disarmament offers greater security than any alternative, including deterrence doctrines, including non-proliferation, including endless increases in military spending, including in sanctions, including exports control, and including other policy instruments. In short, disarmament, in everyone's opinion, is the right thing to do, and it works. With disarmament, we're not simply fleeing something, but we're actually seeking something, and that is a safer world for humanity without nuclear weapons. The clarity of our common goal is our greatest asset in the disarmament community. Our shared objective is much more ambitious than merely reducing the risk of use of these weapons, halting their spread, preventing terrorists from acquiring them, or reducing their number. Those are all worthy goals, but they're not sufficient to eliminate the risk that such weapons will be used, either willfully or by accident. So let us follow the course that our moral compass dictates. Let us not rest until our journey is complete, and let us remain united in the pursuit of this eminently just cause. Thank you.
Dr. Muzammil Siddiqui is the chairman of the Fiqh Council of North America and a member of the Council of Mosques in the United States and Canada. That means he is one of the great intellectual leaders of the Muslim community. He internationally is a member of the Supreme Islamic Council of Egypt and the Supreme Council of Mosques in Mecca, Saudi Arabia, and a member of the Executive Board of the International Assembly of the Council of Ulama in Mecca. There are simply no other intellectual voices for the analysis of the morality of nuclear weapons in the Muslim world from a moral and legal perspective. It is a great honor to have Dr. Siddiqui address us.
Ambassador of Philippines, Libran Cabactulan, President of GSI, Jonathan Granoff, distinguished panelists, ambassadors, Your Excellencies, Your Honors. It's an honor to be here. My organization, Fiqh Council of North America, the Muslim Jurist Council of North America, as well as the Islamic Society of North America, has been working with other religious bodies on this issue of nuclear disarmament. About 10 years ago, we had a meeting with Church's Center for Theology and Public Policy, and we published a full report on that. Various papers were presented. I want to re-emphasize the Islamic position on nuclear armaments. Nuclear weapons pose a grave danger to all humanity. There is certainly a great need that various ethical traditions, whether religious or humanitarian, work together to remove this danger from the world. Islam teaches that God is the creator, master, and owner of everything in this world. All human beings are one family. Human beings must honor each other and should live in peace and do justice to each other. God has given this earth and all its resources as a trust to human beings. It is the duty of the human beings to use them carefully, not to misuse them or waste them. The aggression or injustice, of course, should be removed, but should be removed by proper means. War must be a limited enterprise. It should be avoided as much as possible, and it should be limited only against the aggressors. There are specific rules in Islam about who should declare war, when to wage war, and how to conduct warfare, very similar to the just war theory in Judaism, Christianity, and other traditions. I would not go into any detail about that, but I just want to say that nuclear weapons do not come anywhere in the concept of just war. It is just war. There is no justice in it. Nuclear weapons are by nature weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear weapons make no distinction between combatants and non-combatants. They cause permanent damage to environment. They may cause damage to neutral states also. They are not proportionate responses to any conventional attack. Nuclear weapons destroy human and animal life, affect and destroy the life of future generations by causing diseases and infections. And there are many other problems with these weapons. These weapons are very expensive to develop and maintain. United States alone, as we learn, is spend about $90 million every day on maintaining these weapons. There are always a possibility of human and technical error that may cause nuclear disaster. They can fall in the hands of rogue elements in the military using such weapons, and they may fall into the hands of militants or terrorist groups. It is possible that a conventional war may quickly escalate into a nuclear war. These weapons are dangerous also for those who own them. WMD are also known as MAD, mutually assured destruction. Accidents or natural disasters such as earthquake or tsunami may also bring nuclear disasters. Because of these and many other, it is absolutely forbidden, according to Islamic legal tradition and ethical tradition, to develop, deploy nuclear weapons. The Sharia, the ethical and the moral law of Islam absolutely prohibit the development of such destructive weapons. To hold that there should be a universal ban on the development, possession, and deployment of these weapons. There is no legal or moral criteria to permit some states to maintain these weapons while others are denied. If some nations possess, then there will always be an incentive for others to have them. Islamic law recognizes the doctrine of deterrence in war. Nations are allowed to have forces and weapons that can deter their enemies to attack them. However, the argument for nuclear deterrence will remain as long as some nations have these weapons. If all nations agree to get rid of these weapons, then there will be no need for nuclear deterrence. Complete nuclear disarmament is the most appropriate way to achieve nuclear deterrence. The honest and fair position should be to eliminate these weapons. There is no justification for some to have and others to be denied. These weapons should be delegitimized and should not be used as a threat. There should be a universal ban on these weapons. All countries should be inspected without any exception. Thank you.
Before our closing speaker, I wanted to just, where I'm sitting here, there's several people I feel are so extraordinary they should be recognized. First and foremost is one of my teachers, Senator Douglas Roach, who was one of the founders of the Middle Powers Initiative, Parliamentarians for Global Action, just so many initiatives. My friend and colleague Michael Biowitz is one of the leaders of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association and has sat on the governing council of the larger American Bar Association. Absolutely. And my close friend and colleague Alan Ware, who is the visionary who has led in the creation of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament, which is now in, I think, over 80 countries, and has, leaders leaders in parliaments. One of our early members is Federica Mogherini, has just become the foreign minister of Italy. Also, Andy Cantor from International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, Aaron Tovish from Mayors for Peace, and I see diplomats from Egypt and all over the world. And so I hope that this message resonates and can keep expanding. And I am sure that you will see this as the beginning of something. And however, our closing speaker has been on the case of moral leadership for a long time and is one of the most respected rabbis in the world. He was the president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and he is a member of the Board of Trustees of the Union for Reform Judaism and the Hebrew Union College. He's the past chair of the Liturgy and Reform Practices Committee. He's one of the leading inspirations in the Jewish community and one of its leading intellectuals as well, Rabbi Peter Noble.
I'm deeply honored to be here and deeply grateful to the organizers, but even more deeply grateful to these very important interreligious leaders who are here, as well as the leaders of this great international body who are committed to this great task. I am a longtime Reform rabbi and one who served for over 30 years at a synagogue which was a self-proclaimed nuclear weapons-free zone. As religious leaders and as interreligious leaders, we turn to our sacred traditions to inform our thinking on the great moral issues we face as individuals and nations. Nuclear weapons are an anathema to anyone concerned about the future of humanity and its fragile ecosystem. I want to repeat what has been said a number of times before. Nuclear weapons represent the power to not only inflict massive damage to soldiers, citizens, animals, and plants without discernment, but also actually to reverse the gift of creation and make our planet uninhabitable. Emblazoned on the wall of this great body are the words of the Hebrew prophet Isaiah, "And he shall judge between the nations and reprove many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." The destruction of all weapons and the cessation of all war is a primary goal of the visionaries who created the United Nations. The Israeli poet Yehuda Amichai bids us go even further than Isaiah. He writes, "Don't stop beating after the swords into plowshares. Don't stop. Go on beating and make musical instruments out of them. Whoever wants to make war again will have to turn them into plowshares first." The poet's vision calls forth our highest ideals. Let us at least fulfill the promise of the first resolution of the United Nations General Assembly of January 24th, 1946, which calls for the elimination of atomic and other weapons of mass destruction. Back in 1982, during the Cold War, the Central Conference of American Rabbis adopted a resolution entitled Bilateral Nuclear Arms Freeze and Reduction. It reads in part, "A nuclear war, even a limited one, would result in death, injury, and disease on a scale without precedent. Civil defense and medical treatment would be totally inadequate. Our traditions speak to us of sakanat nifashot, the danger of exposing ourselves to health hazards, bal tashchit, the abhorrence of willful destruction of the environment, and yishuv haaretz, the betterment and guardianship of the earth. Inspired by prophets, we raise our voices." Today, with over 17,000 nuclear weapons in existence, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons by accident, design, or madness remains real. Today, we must raise our voices again. We must say together, nuclear weapons are immoral, and for that reason, we must work together to eliminate them. The values of Bal Tashchit, wanton destruction, are embodied in the rules of war as set forth in Deuteronomy. When you lay siege to a city for many days, battling against it in order to capture it, do not destroy its trees, wielding the axe against them, for from them you eat, and you may not cut them down. Limiting destructive capacity is not a new imperative, nor is it limited to just humanity. In our tradition, God informs humanity in the story of Noah with a beautiful emphasis of a rainbow that followed the great flood, that God pledged never again to destroy creation through a flood, a mabul mayim. Surely God's placing restraint on himself should guide our own restraints. Do we have a right to place creation itself at such risk? We, through great effort and great cost, have developed a new kind of flood, a mabul eish, a flood of nuclear fire, to do that which God has pledged not to do. Is this not the pinnacle of arrogance? It is not enough to merely stop proliferation. We are morally compelled to eliminate nuclear weapons. It is our duty to cherish and protect creation, to learn to love and care for one another. It is time to beat our nuclear swords into plowshares and not stop beating until they are musical instruments.
The Religions for Peace has published an outstanding booklet for guidance for religious leaders and communities. We will be reaching out with this moral message to civil society groups, but we felt that organizations that have a particular spiritual power, which is based on the power of love, based on the power of reverence, based on the power of the sacred, have not had the proper forum in the international debate. And that's why we've done this. But we want people of all good faith, people of all goodwill to come together condemning nuclear weapons and setting forth a compass point. We know it won't be easy to bring the speeding car, into compliance with the speed limit. We know it can't happen overnight, but we need the compass point. But sentiment, moral sentiment without law won't have traction. And I want to recognize one of the great lawyers of the world here, John Burroughs, who has framed it as, we're either going to pursue the law of power or the power of law to bring us into world stability. And the religious voices, I would say, almost pose it, because this is what spiritual power is about. It's the power of love, the power of reverence. And it's either going to be the power of love or the love of power. And that's what's before us. So if we only have law without moral compass, and why it's so important that the moral message enter into the debate is that law without moral foundation is the foundation of tyranny. And moral sentiment without law lacks traction. So we have to have both. And it's my feeling that bringing the two together is what can help make the change that our very survival depends upon. It is the ultimate blasphemy to put the entirety of creation at risk. We simply don't have the right to do it. And I'm quoting George Kennan on that. People of reason, people of heart. We listen to the deliberations of the diplomats. They're doing the best they can. But the passion of our moral sentiment must be the fuel that drives the car forward. I will now hand it over to distinguished Ambassador Cabactulan.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you to all of you who have given us the best that we would like really to hear. I'm also like a timekeeper and a watch, and a guardian of all these things. But permit me, because I was really inspired by rabbis revisiting the first UN resolution on abolition. Because I remember the foremost diplomat, Filipino diplomat, Romulo. He said that peace is not written in documents, in the words. It is carved, it's written in the hearts of men. And that's why we have to start with that. When I was the president of the 2010 Review Conference in 2010, I met with the civil societies with NGOs. The first word I said to them, you have not done enough yet. I would like to conclude by saying that hopefully, as I've said, we might see the end of the tunnel, that maybe not repeating what has been said of Jonathan about the law, about morality, about tyranny without and moral and traction of law. I just want to say that maybe it would be nice to hear and to see in the future that maybe every pulpit, every sermon, every synagogue, in every corner, we hear a resounding voice about this could be nothing but an instrument of sin, an instrument of evil, and so be it, and should be done with it for once and for all. Thank you.
The administration here requires us to, unless you're a diplomat, to exit via the doors in the back. But if you're a diplomat, you're free to roam. Thank you.